You need a home, and I need a dad. Daniel offered her a small, tired smile. That's a very big thing to say to someone you just met, he said kindly. The girl looked up at him with calm curiosity. Why? Daniel rubbed his gloved hands together to warm them. Well, he explained gently, usually children shouldn't invite strangers home. Your mom might worry if she knew you were talking to someone you don't know. The girl considered that for a moment. My mom says most people are good, she replied. Daniel nodded slowly. I think she's right, but it's still good to be careful. The girl didn't seem frightened at all. Does your mother know you're out here? Daniel asked. She thinks I'm asleep. Daniel couldn't help smiling a little. That sounds like the kind of adventure that might get you into trouble later. The girl shrugged. I just needed to think. Daniel glanced toward the quiet street. Boston was alive tonight. People hurried past bundled in coats, laughing with friends and carrying bags of food or bottles of champagne. Everyone seemed to be heading somewhere warm. Everyone except the two of them. Beside Daniel's boots rested a small leather suitcase. Everything he owned now fit inside it. Annie pointed at the small suitcase near his feet. Where is your home? Daniel followed her finger and looked down at the worn leather case. For several seconds, he didn't answer. I don't have one anymore, he said quietly. Annie blinked. You lost it? In a way. She studied him carefully, as if trying to understand how someone could lose something that big. My mom says homes are where families are, Annie said softly. Daniel gave a faint smile. That's a good way to think about it. Annie brushed some snow away with the toe of her boot. My mom says my dad had to leave before New Year's Eve, she continued. She says maybe one day he'll come back. Daniel listened quietly. But tonight, Annie said slowly. I heard my grandma talking. Daniel looked at her gently. What did she say? Annie hesitated, then answered in a quiet voice. She said my dad didn't really leave. Daniel waited. She said I'm what people call a child outside marriage. Annie struggled with the phrase. She said my dad has another family now. He has a wife and 2 boys, Annie continued. My grandma said tonight he's probably celebrating New Year's with them. Daniel felt a tight heaviness settle in his chest. Annie finally looked up at him again. She said some kids are born without dads. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. For a moment, the two of them sat quietly together as snow continued falling around the small bus stop. Far away, someone cheered as a test firework burst over the river. Then Annie spoke again. You said you lost your home, she said gently. Daniel nodded. Yes. And your family? Daniel looked toward the dark street. Yes, he said softly. Annie seemed to think about that for a long moment. Then she turned toward him again, her voice quiet but full of hope. Tonight is New Year's Eve, she said. Daniel nodded. It is. On New Year's Eve, Annie continued. Families are supposed to be together. My friends at school say they stay up late with their moms and dads and eat snacks and watch the fireworks. Daniel listened. They all sit together, Annie said. And when the clock reaches midnight, everyone hugs. Her small voice softened. I've always wanted that. Daniel felt his throat tighten slightly. I just want one New Year's where I can sit at the table with a dad too, Annie added. She looked at him again, her eyes bright in the cold night. That's why I said what I said. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Annie repeated it softly, but with quiet certainty. You need a home to return to, and I need a dad. The wind moved softly through the empty bus stop. Daniel stared at the little girl beside him, unsure whether he should laugh or feel something deeper. A year ago, he had been one of the richest men in Boston. Now he was simply a man sitting at a bus stop with a suitcase and nowhere to go. But somehow, on the last night of the year, a little girl had just offered him something he thought he had lost forever. A place to belong. Daniel shifted slightly on the wooden bench, still holding the silver pocket watch in his gloved hand. The small girl beside him watched the falling snow for a few seconds, then suddenly turned toward him again as if remembering something important. Wait, she said. Daniel looked at her. Yes? I just realized something. What's that? You never told me your name. Daniel blinked once, surprised. She was right. They had been talking for several minutes, yet neither of them had properly introduced themselves. The girl straightened slightly and extended a mitten-covered hand with surprising seriousness. My name is Annie, she announced politely. Annie Carter. Daniel couldn't help smiling at the formal gesture. He shook her tiny mitten carefully. Nice to meet you, Annie Carter. And your name? She asked. Daniel. Thanks for watching. She tilted her head. Just Daniel? He chuckled. That's usually how introductions work. Annie seemed to think about that. Okay then, she said with a small nod. Nice to meet you, Daniel. The way she said it made the moment feel oddly official, like they had just signed an agreement. For the first time that evening, Daniel felt a faint warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with his coat. Annie looked at him thoughtfully. Were you important before? The question came so naturally that Daniel didn't feel defensive hearing it. I used to run a company, he said. Like a store? Something like that, Daniel replied, but with computers. Annie nodded as if she fully understood. My friend Marcus says computers run the whole world. Sometimes it feels that way. What happened to your company? Daniel watched a snowplow crawl slowly down the distant street. It stopped running. Annie absorbed that quietly. My grandma says sometimes grown-ups lose things, she said. That's true. But she also says sometimes losing things helps you find something better. Daniel looked at her with curiosity. Your grandma sounds like she's had a long life. She has. They sat quietly for a moment again. The wind brushed softly against the bus shelter. In the distance, another burst of fireworks flickered faintly against the clouds. Annie suddenly spoke again. Daniel? Yes. Did you ever want to be a dad? The question caught him off guard. Daniel looked down at the silver pocket watch again. Yes, he said after a moment. Very much. What happened? Daniel closed the watch gently. Life took a different path. Annie nodded slowly, as if she understood more than most children her age. I think paths can change again, she said. Daniel smiled faintly. That's an optimistic way to see things. My grandma says hope is like a door. How so? It doesn't open if nobody tries the handle. Daniel let out a soft laugh. That might be the smartest thing I've heard all week. Annie seemed pleased. Across the street, two couples hurried past holding takeout bags and laughing loudly. One of them glanced toward the bus stop briefly, probably wondering why a man and a small child were sitting there so calmly in the snow. Daniel checked the pocket watch again. Ombir, Iliki PM, 8 minutes until midnight. Annie noticed the watch. That's a pretty one. It was my wife's gift, Daniel said. You were married? Yes. Is she working tonight like my mom? Daniel shook his head slowly. No. Annie didn't ask more questions. Children had a way of sensing when silence was the kindest response. Instead, she looked toward the street again where more people were walking quickly, bundled in scarves and hats. Everyone is going somewhere, she said. Daniel followed her gaze. Yes, probably to celebrate together. That's usually how New Year's works. Annie thought about that. Families sit together at midnight, she said softly. Daniel nodded. They do. They hug. Yes. And sometimes they make wishes. Daniel smiled slightly. That's also true. Annie turned toward him again. That's why I wanted to come outside tonight. Daniel studied her face. To make a wish? Yes. What kind of wish? Annie spoke very simply. I wanted to sit with someone who could be my dad. Daniel felt the quiet weight of those words settle between them again. If this moment touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because we love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy stories about hope, family, and second chances, subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the next one. He looked down the empty street. A year ago, he had been surrounded by investors, colleagues, and reporters. Tonight, he was sitting at a bus stop with a little girl who made the most honest wish he had heard in years. The strange thing was that it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt real. Daniel looked back at Annie. Well, he said gently, that's a very important wish. Annie nodded. And you wished for a home. Daniel gave a soft smile. I suppose I did. The church bells across the neighborhood began ringing softly again. Annie's eyes widened. That means midnight is almost here. Daniel checked his watch again. Elibesh PM. 5 minutes. The last 5 minutes of a year that had taken everything from him. Annie suddenly hopped off the bench and brushed snow from her coat. Daniel? Yes? My house really is just a few blocks away. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I believe you. My grandma will probably still be awake. I imagine she might. Annie looked up at him hopefully. Would you like to walk with me? Daniel hesitated. It was a simple question, but the last year of his life had been filled with decisions that carried enormous consequences. This one felt strangely small, and yet somehow important. He looked at the little girl standing beside him in the falling snow. Then he looked down at the suitcase that held everything he owned. The bus he had been pretending to wait for was never coming. But Annie was already walking a few steps down the sidewalk before turning back toward him. Well? she asked with a hopeful smile. Daniel picked up the suitcase slowly. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to direction. Yes, he said gently. I think I'd like that. Daniel Whitaker followed Annie Carter into the quiet Boston street, the small leather suitcase swinging gently at his side. The snow had begun to fall more steadily now, covering the sidewalks in a thin white layer that softened every sound. The city around them still buzzed with energy. Laughter drifted from apartment windows, music echoed through the cold night, and occasionally a car passed with people inside shouting excitedly about the coming new year. But the street Annie walked down was calmer. Old brick houses lined both sides of the road. Small porch lights glowed warmly above snowy steps. Some windows revealed families gathered around dinner tables or televisions waiting for the midnight countdown. Daniel noticed how easily Annie moved through the winter night, as if she had walked this street 1,000 times. She stopped suddenly and turned back toward him. You're walking very slowly, she observed. Daniel smiled faintly. I'm carrying my entire life in this suitcase, he replied. Annie looked at the bag thoughtfully. That must be heavy. Daniel chuckled. You have no idea. She began walking again, her boots making small crunching sounds in the snow. For several steps, neither of them spoke. Daniel found himself studying the quiet neighborhood. It had been a long time since he had walked through a normal residential street like this. His old life had been filled with offices, private drivers, and business meetings. Even his home had sat high above the city where the streets below looked distant and quiet. Down here, everything felt different, real. After a minute, Annie spoke again. My grandma says winter streets are honest. Daniel looked down at her. What does that mean? She pointed ahead where the soft glow of house windows lit the sidewalk. You can see where people belong. Daniel followed her gaze. Families moved behind those windows. Someone carried a tray of food through a dining room. A child ran across a living room holding what looked like a sparkler. A couple stood together on a porch watching the snow fall. Everywhere he looked, there were small pieces of life continuing without him. Annie's voice interrupted his thoughts. Daniel? Yes? Are you cold? A little. You can warm up soon. Daniel smiled gently. You sound very confident about that. My grandma always makes soup on New Year's Eve. Soap. Chicken soup, Annie said proudly. She says it keeps the whole house warm. Daniel laughed softly. That sounds like a good tradition. They reached the corner of another street, and Annie paused to check both directions before crossing. Daniel noticed the careful way she looked left and right before stepping off the curb. Your mom taught you that? He asked. My grandma did. They continued walking. Above them, the sky flickered again as another test firework lit the clouds for a moment. Annie gasped happily. I love fireworks. Your mom lets you stay up for them? Sometimes. Daniel checked the silver watch in his hand again. Ombir, Elia de Peme, 3 minutes until midnight. The realization made him slow slightly. 1 year ago, he had stood on the balcony of his Beacon Hill home watching fireworks explode over the river with Emily beside him. Now he was walking down a quiet neighborhood street beside a 6-year-old girl he had met less than 15 minutes ago. Life had strange ways of rewriting its own story. Annie suddenly stopped again. Almost there, she said. Daniel looked ahead. A small blue house stood halfway down the block. Warm light glowed from the kitchen window, and a string of simple holiday lights hung along the front porch railing. It wasn't large, but it looked alive. Daniel felt something tighten quietly in his chest. Annie pointed proudly. That's my house. Daniel studied it for a moment. It looks nice. My grandma decorated the lights. She did a good job. Annie beamed at the compliment. They walked closer. From inside the house, Daniel could see the shape of an older woman moving slowly through the kitchen. Steam drifted above what looked like a pot on the stove. Annie glanced back at him. See? I told you she'd still be awake. Daniel hesitated slightly as they approached the front steps. You're sure this is all right? He asked gently. Annie tilted her head. Why wouldn't it be? Well, Daniel said carefully. Most grandmothers might be surprised if their granddaughter brings home a stranger right before midnight. Annie considered that. She might ask questions. That's usually how grandmothers work. But you're not dangerous, Annie said with simple certainty. Daniel laughed quietly. I appreciate your confidence. They reached the porch steps just as church bells somewhere in the neighborhood began to ring. Annie's eyes widened. That's the midnight bells. Daniel checked the watch again. Onbir. Elidokus p.m. 1 minute. Inside the house, the television volume suddenly rose as a countdown began somewhere in the living room. 10, 9. The voices from the broadcast echoed faintly through the window. Annie stood very still on the porch beside him. "Daniel?" she asked. "Yes? Do you think it still counts if you make a New Year's wish a few seconds early?" Daniel smiled. "I think wishes follow their own rules." Annie closed her eyes tightly. Daniel watched her for a moment. Then the voices from inside the television shouted the final numbers. 3, 2, 1. Fireworks exploded across the Boston skyline. Bright flashes of red and gold lit the snow-covered street. Inside the house, the television audience cheered loudly. Annie opened her eyes again. "Happy New Year," she said. Daniel looked at her. For the first time in 12 months, the words didn't feel empty. "Happy New Year, Annie." She grinned. "See? Now the year started with both of us not being alone." Daniel glanced at the small house glowing warmly behind the door. For a moment he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Possibility. Annie reached for the door handle. "Ready to meet my grandma?" she asked. Daniel adjusted his grip on the suitcase. Then he nodded. "I think I am." Annie pushed the door open with the easy confidence of someone returning to a place that had always been safe. Warm air immediately spilled onto the porch, carrying the comforting smell of chicken soup and freshly baked bread. After the cold silence of the street, the little house felt alive. Daniel stepped inside slowly, brushing snow from his coat and boots. For a moment he remained near the doorway, unsure exactly how a man in his situation was supposed to enter a stranger's home on New Year's Eve. The kitchen light glowed warmly at the far end of the hallway. A small television in the living room continued broadcasting the celebration in Times Square, the crowd on screen cheering as fireworks burst behind them. From the kitchen came the voice of an older woman. "Annie? Honey? Was that the door?" Annie quickly hung her coat on a small hook near the entrance. "Yes, Grandma, I'm back." Daniel heard slow footsteps approaching. A moment later, an elderly woman appeared in the doorway to the kitchen. She was small but carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had lived a long life. Silver hair was tied neatly behind her head, and she wore a soft blue sweater with an apron tied around her waist. Her hands still held a wooden spoon, but the moment her eyes landed on Daniel, she stopped, not frightened, just surprised. "Annie," she said slowly. "Who is this gentleman?" Annie stepped forward confidently. "This is Daniel." Daniel gave a polite nod. "Good evening, ma'am." The older woman studied him carefully for a moment. Years of experience showed in the way she observed him, not suspiciously, but thoughtfully. Then she looked down at Annie. "Would you mind explaining why Daniel is standing in our hallway on New Year's Eve?" Annie clasped her hands behind her back. "I met him at the bus stop." The wooden spoon lowered slightly. "The bus stop?" "Yes." There was a short pause. The woman looked back at Daniel again. Daniel felt it was only fair to explain. "I'm very sorry for the surprise," he said gently. "Your granddaughter found me sitting there alone and insisted I shouldn't spend New Year's Eve by myself." The older woman blinked once. Then she slowly placed the spoon on the kitchen counter and walked closer. Daniel noticed the calm strength in her expression. She extended her hand politely. "My name is Ruth Carter." Daniel shook it carefully. "Daniel Whitaker." "Well, Mr. Whitaker," Ruth said kindly, "I suppose meeting strangers on New Year's Eve is not something Annie normally does." Annie raised her hand slightly. "I had a good reason." Ruth looked at her. "And what reason would that be?" Annie answered simply, "He needed a home." Daniel glanced down, slightly embarrassed by the blunt explanation. Ruth crossed her arms gently, but her eyes softened. "And how exactly did you come to that conclusion?" Annie pointed toward the suitcase Daniel still held. He was sitting alone with that. Ruth studied the suitcase for a moment. Then she looked back at Daniel. "Well," she said calmly, "that does sound like the beginning of a story." Daniel gave a small, humble smile. "It's been a long year." Ruth nodded. Many people could say the same. She turned toward the kitchen. "Since you're already here, Mr. Whitaker, you might as well come in and warm up." Daniel hesitated. "That's very kind of you, but I don't want to impose." Ruth waved her hand gently. "Anyone standing outside in this weather would be an imposition on common sense." Annie grinned. "See? I told you." Daniel finally stepped fully into the house. The warmth was immediate and comforting. The living room was small but welcoming. A soft couch sat near the television, and a modest Christmas tree stood in the corner with simple ornaments and white lights. On the coffee table sat 3 mugs and a bowl of popcorn. Ruth noticed Daniel looking around. "Nothing fancy," she said. "But it keeps us warm." Daniel nodded sincerely. "It's a lovely home." Annie climbed onto the couch and tucked her feet beneath her. We were about to watch the fireworks. Ruth returned to the kitchen and lifted the lid from the large pot on the stove. Steam rose into the air. "Mr. Whitaker," she called gently. "Have you eaten tonight?" Daniel realized he had not. "Not yet," he admitted. "Well then," Ruth said firmly. "You're just in time." She began ladling soup into bowls. Daniel placed his suitcase carefully near the door. The smell of the soup filled the small kitchen, chicken, herbs, and something warm and familiar that reminded him unexpectedly of childhood. Ruth set 3 bowls on the small dining table. "Come sit." Daniel hesitated again. "You're sure this is all right?" Ruth looked at him with quiet understanding. "Mr. Whitaker, when the year ends, people should not be alone." Daniel felt those words settle somewhere deep in his chest. He pulled out a chair and sat. Annie watched happily from across the table. "See?" she said proudly. "Now we're all together." Ruth handed Daniel a spoon. He held it for a moment before speaking. "You know," he said softly, "this is the first meal I've had at a table in quite a while." Ruth didn't ask questions. She simply nodded. "That happens sometimes." From the living room, the television announcer's voice echoed again as another round of fireworks began lighting the Boston sky. Bright flashes flickered through the window. Annie ran to the couch and pointed excitedly. "Come look." Daniel stood and walked toward the window. Outside, fireworks burst above the city in bright colors. Red, gold, blue. Their reflections shimmered across the snow-covered rooftops. Annie stood beside him watching the sky. "Pretty, right?" she whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. For the first time in many months, the fireworks did not remind him of everything he had lost. Instead, they felt like something else entirely. A beginning. Behind them, Ruth Carter watched quietly from the kitchen doorway. Then she smiled gently to herself, because sometimes, on the coldest nights of the year, the right people somehow find their way to the same door. The fireworks over Boston continued for nearly 20 minutes. Annie watched every single one. She knelt on the couch with her hands pressed against the window, her face glowing with excitement every time a burst of color spread across the winter sky. "Did you see that one?" she gasped. Daniel stood beside her, holding a mug of hot chocolate Ruth had quietly placed in his hands. "Yes," he said with a small smile. "That one was impressive." Another firework exploded in gold above the rooftops. Annie laughed softly. "My grandma says fireworks are like the sky celebrating." Daniel glanced toward Ruth, who was sitting calmly at the kitchen table finishing her soup. "She sounds like a wise woman," he said. Ruth raised an eyebrow. "I've lived long enough to notice a few things." The fireworks slowly began to fade, leaving behind only drifting smoke and quiet snow falling over the neighborhood again. Annie finally climbed down from the couch and returned to the table. Ruth slid another slice of warm bread toward Daniel. "You look like a man who hasn't had a proper meal in a while," she said. Daniel hesitated. "I suppose that's fair." He broke the bread slowly. For a moment, none of them spoke. The house was quiet again, except for the low sound of the television. Finally, Ruth leaned back in her chair. "So, Mr. Whitaker," she said calmly, "what exactly brought you to a bus stop on New Year's Eve?" Daniel considered the question carefully. He had spent the last year explaining his situation to bankers, lawyers, and reporters. Those conversations had always felt like battles. This felt different. He chose his words slowly. "A year ago, I ran a technology company here in Boston," he began. Annie's eyes widened. "Like computers?" "Yes," Daniel said gently. "Were you rich?" Annie asked with complete innocence. Ruth cleared her throat softly. "Annie, it's all right," Daniel said with a quiet smile. "Yes," he admitted. "At one time I was." Annie blinked. "So what happened?" Daniel looked down at his hands. "Several things happened at once." He spoke calmly, but the memories still carried weight. The market shifted. Investors panicked. The company collapsed faster than we expected. Ruth nodded slowly. "I've seen that happen to good people before," Daniel continued. "While all that was happening, my wife was sick." Annie leaned forward slightly. "Sick like the flu?" Daniel shook his head gently. "No, something more serious." "Did she get better?" Daniel's voice softened. "No." The small room grew quiet. Annie seemed to understand enough not to ask more questions. Ruth spoke instead. I'm sorry for your loss. Daniel nodded. Thank you. He took another sip of the hot chocolate. After she passed, the rest of my life unraveled pretty quickly. Annie looked at the suitcase near the door. That's why everything you own fits in that bag? Daniel smiled faintly. Yes. Annie sat quietly for a moment. Then she said something unexpected. Well, you still have your watch. Daniel glanced down at the silver pocket watch in his hand. Yes, he said softly. I do. Annie seemed satisfied with that. Ruth folded her hands on the table. So tonight you were simply sitting there, deciding what comes next. Daniel nodded. That's one way to put it. Ruth studied him thoughtfully. You strike me as a man who spent most of his life making plans. Daniel let out a quiet breath. That used to be true. And tonight, Daniel admitted, I had no plan at all. Annie smiled proudly. Now you do. Daniel looked at her. Do I? You came here. Ruth chuckled softly. She does have a point. Daniel leaned back in the chair. The strange thing was, the tension he had carried for months felt lighter in this small kitchen. The house smelled like soup and bread. The television murmured softly. And across the table sat a grandmother and her granddaughter who had welcomed a stranger without asking anything in return. Ruth stood slowly and began gathering the bowls. Mr. Whitaker, she said, do you have somewhere to sleep tonight? Daniel hesitated. Not yet. Ruth nodded as if she expected that answer. Well, she said calmly, Boston hotels are very expensive on New Year's Eve. Daniel chuckled softly. That they are. Ruth dried her hands on a towel. Fortunately, this house has a small guest room. Daniel straightened slightly. I couldn't possibly. Ruth raised a hand gently. You're not the first traveler to pass through our door. Annie clapped happily. See, I told you he needed a home. Daniel laughed under his breath. This was your plan the entire time, wasn't it? Annie grinned. Maybe a little. Ruth looked at Daniel kindly. You can stay the night, Mr. Whitaker. Tomorrow you can decide where life takes you next. Daniel looked at the warm room around him. For months he had been drifting through the ruins of his old life. But somehow, on the first night of a new year, he had found himself sitting at a small kitchen table in a quiet Boston home. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was alone. He nodded slowly. Thank you. Annie raised her mug of hot chocolate like a toast. Happy New Year, Daniel. Daniel lifted his own mug. Happy New Year, Annie. And outside, as the snow continued to fall gently across the city, the first quiet hours of the new year began. The house had grown quiet by the time the dishes were washed and the television volume turned down. Outside, the last echoes of fireworks had faded, leaving only the soft hush of falling snow across the Boston neighborhood. The streetlights glowed against the white sidewalks, and the occasional car passed slowly through the peaceful streets. Inside the small blue house, warmth lingered in every room. Annie had begun to yawn. At first she tried to hide it, covering her mouth with both hands as if the yawn might escape and embarrass her. But after the third one, Ruth noticed immediately. Well, Ruth said gently, drying the last dish with a towel, I think someone has reached the end of her New Year's Eve adventure. Annie rubbed her eyes. I'm not tired, she said automatically. Daniel chuckled softly from the chair near the table. That might be the most famous sentence children say before falling asleep. Annie tried to protest, but another yawn interrupted her. Ruth smiled. All right, young lady, pajamas. Annie slid down from the chair. Before heading down the hallway, she paused beside Daniel. Don't go anywhere, she said seriously. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I don't have anywhere to go tonight, remember? She nodded, satisfied with that answer. Good. Then she disappeared down the hallway toward her room. Ruth finished drying the dishes and hung the towel neatly beside the sink. For a moment she stood quietly at the counter, listening to the gentle sounds of Annie moving around in the other room. Daniel remained seated, unsure whether he should speak. Finally Ruth turned toward him. You handled that conversation with Annie very kindly, she said. Daniel shrugged lightly. She's an easy child to talk to. Ruth smiled faintly. She always has been. Daniel looked toward the hallway where Annie had disappeared. She's very perceptive. That comes from paying attention, Ruth replied. Something many adults forget to do. Daniel nodded slowly. I noticed that. Ruth poured 2 cups of tea and set one in front of Daniel before sitting across from him. Steam curled gently upward between them. You said earlier that this year has been difficult, she said calmly. Daniel considered the cup in his hands. That might be an understatement. Ruth studied him quietly. I won't ask for details you don't want to share. Daniel appreciated the respect in her tone. That's kind of you. But I will say this, Ruth continued. Life sometimes strips things away so we can see what truly matters. Daniel looked up at her. That sounds like something Annie might say. Ruth chuckled softly. She learned it from listening. For a moment, they both sipped their tea in comfortable silence. Then Ruth asked gently, "Do you have any family left?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "My parents passed away several years ago." "And siblings?" "None." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "So Annie wasn't wrong when she said you were alone tonight." Daniel gave a quiet smile. "No, she wasn't." The hallway light flicked off, and a few seconds later Annie returned wearing soft blue pajamas with tiny snowflakes printed across them. Her hair had been brushed and tied loosely behind her head. She carried something in her hands. A small, folded blanket. She walked straight to Daniel and handed it to him. "You might need this," she said. Daniel blinked in surprise. "For what?" "In case you get cold in the guest room." Daniel accepted the blanket gently. "Thank you, Annie." She nodded seriously. "My grandma says guests should always feel comfortable." Ruth smiled. "I do say that." Annie climbed onto the couch and curled into the corner. "Can we watch the fireworks replay before I go to bed?" she asked, hopefully. Ruth glanced at the clock. "It's already past midnight." "Just 5 minutes?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I think 5 minutes sounds reasonable for a New Year's tradition." Ruth pretended to consider the idea. "Well," she said finally, "since our guest approves." Annie grabbed the remote happily and turned the television volume up slightly. On the screen, the earlier fireworks display replayed in bright colors above the Boston skyline. The room filled again with flashes of red and gold. Annie watched with sleepy fascination. Within minutes, her head leaned slowly against the arm of the couch. Daniel noticed it first. "She's falling asleep." Ruth stood quietly. "That happens every year." Daniel watched as Annie's eyes closed completely. Ruth gently covered her with a small quilt from the back of the couch. "She'll sleep better in her bed," Daniel said softly. Ruth nodded. "Would you mind helping me carry her?" Daniel stood carefully. Together they lifted the sleeping child. Annie stirred slightly but didn't wake. Daniel carried her down the short hallway, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. Ruth opened the bedroom door. The room was small but cheerful, filled with books, drawings taped to the walls, and a stuffed bear resting on the pillow. Daniel laid Annie gently on the bed. She murmured something softly in her sleep. Ruth pulled the blanket up around her shoulders. "Thank you," Ruth whispered. Daniel stepped quietly back into the hallway. They returned to the living room where the television now showed the last clips of the night's celebrations. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ruth turned toward him. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need to get back on your feet," she said calmly. Daniel looked at her, surprised. "That's very generous." Ruth shrugged lightly. "I've learned something after 70 years. "What's that?" "People sometimes arrive in our lives for a reason." Daniel glanced toward the hallway where Annie slept. "Your granddaughter believes that." Ruth smiled gently. "Yes," she said. "She does." Outside, the snowfall continued quietly, and inside the small house, Daniel Whitaker realized something surprising. For the first time in a very long while, he was no longer wondering where he would sleep. He already knew. Morning arrived quietly. Daniel Whitaker woke slowly, unsure for a moment where he was. For the past year, waking up had usually meant opening his eyes to unfamiliar ceilings, cheap motels, borrowed couches, airport lounges, and once even a train station bench when the night had stretched longer than expected. But this ceiling was different. Soft morning light filtered through pale curtains, casting gentle patterns across the small guest room. The air smelled faintly of coffee and something warm cooking in the kitchen. Daniel sat up slowly on the narrow bed. For a moment he simply listened. A house had a very different kind of silence than a hotel room. Here, there were small sounds. The quiet hum of a refrigerator, the creak of old wooden floors, the distant clink of a spoon against a mug. Somewhere down the hallway, Annie's voice floated faintly through the air. "Grandma, do you think Daniel likes pancakes?" Ruth's voice answered calmly. "I imagine most people do." Daniel smiled before he even realized he was doing it. He swung his feet gently onto the floor and noticed the folded blanket Annie had given him the night before, still resting neatly on the chair beside the bed. For reasons he couldn't explain, that small gesture had stayed with him. After washing up, Daniel stepped quietly into the hallway. The smell of breakfast was stronger now. He followed it toward the kitchen. Annie was already sitting at the table in a bright yellow sweater, her legs swinging happily beneath the chair. In front of her sat a plate with 2 pancakes shaped somewhat like uneven circles. She looked up immediately. Daniel. Her face lit up like he had just returned from a long trip instead of waking up in the next room. "Good morning," Daniel said. Ruth turned from the stove with a calm smile. "Well, look who finally decided to join us." Daniel glanced at the clock on the wall. "Am I late?" "Not at all," Ruth said. "Retired grandmothers operate on flexible schedules." Annie pointed proudly at the table. "We saved you pancakes." Daniel sat down. That was very thoughtful. Annie leaned forward. "Did you sleep okay?" "Very well," Daniel said honestly. Ruth placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. "That guest room mattress has been there for 20 years, she said. "It's seen more travelers than a highway motel." Daniel chuckled softly. "I believe it." He took a sip of the coffee. It was strong, simple, and perfect. Outside the window, the neighborhood looked calm beneath fresh snow. The sky was pale blue now, and sunlight reflected brightly across the white rooftops. Annie took a bite of pancake before speaking again. "So what happens today?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Today? Yes. What do you mean?" "Well," Annie said thoughtfully, "yesterday was the old year." Daniel nodded. "That's true. So today is the new year." "Also true." She tilted her head. "That means it's the first day of your new plan." Daniel laughed quietly. "You assume I have a plan." Annie looked very confident. "You will." Ruth sat down across from them. "Children believe the world resets every January 1st, she said. Daniel smiled. "That sounds like a healthy way to live." Annie took another bite of pancake. "My teacher says people make resolutions." "Your teacher is correct. Did you make one?" Daniel paused. For the past year, he had avoided thinking about the future at all. Each day had been about surviving the next problem, the next bill, the next disappointment. Resolutions required hope. He hadn't had much of that. But Annie was watching him expectantly, so he answered honestly, "I suppose my resolution is to figure out what comes next." Annie nodded approvingly. "That's a good one." Ruth leaned back slightly in her chair. "Well," she said calmly, "most people start the new year by cleaning their house." Daniel looked around the cozy kitchen. "It seems pretty clean to me." Ruth smiled. "I wasn't talking about my house." Daniel understood what she meant. Life had a way of accumulating clutter, regrets, mistakes, old failures that weighed down the present. Sometimes the only way forward was to start fresh. Annie suddenly pointed at Daniel's suitcase resting near the wall. "Are you leaving today?" Daniel followed her gaze. The question lingered in the air for a moment. He hadn't decided. Part of him felt like he should leave. After all, he had only arrived here by accident. But another part of him, the quieter part he hadn't listened to in a long time, felt something different. Ruth spoke gently. "You're welcome to stay a little while longer." Daniel looked at her. "That's generous." Generosity is easier when the house already has extra chairs at the table. Annie nodded enthusiastically. "We have 4 chairs." Daniel smiled. "Yes, I noticed." He finished his coffee slowly. Then he looked back at Annie. "What are your plans today?" Annie thought for a moment. "I usually draw pictures on New Year's Day." "What kind of pictures?" "Future pictures." Daniel tilted his head. "Future pictures?" "Yes. I draw what I hope the year will look like." "That sounds like a wonderful tradition." She smiled proudly. "Do you want to see last year's?" "Of course." Annie jumped from her chair and ran down the hallway. Daniel turned toward Ruth. "She's an extraordinary child." Ruth nodded quietly. "She's had to grow up faster than most." Daniel looked toward the hallway. "I'm glad I met her." Ruth studied him thoughtfully. "Sometimes people meet exactly when they need to." Daniel didn't respond immediately, because deep down, he was beginning to realize something. The little girl who had found him at a bus stop might not have just changed her own New Year's Eve. She might have changed his entire life. Annie returned from the hallway carrying a large sheet of paper almost as wide as her arms. She held it carefully, like something important that should not be folded or bent. "Found it," she announced. Daniel turned in his chair as she hurried back to the kitchen table. Ruth smiled quietly and slid her coffee mug aside so Annie could spread the paper across the table. "What are we looking at?" Daniel asked. "My future picture," Annie said proudly. The drawing was made with bright crayons. The lines were uneven, and the shapes were simple, but the colors were full of life. Daniel leaned closer. In the center of the page stood a small house with a yellow roof. Smoke curled from the chimney. A tall stick figure stood beside the house, holding hands with a smaller one. Daniel pointed gently. "That must be you." Annie nodded. "That's me. And this person? That was supposed to be my dad," Annie said matter-of-factly. Daniel looked at the drawing again. The stick figure father had long arms and a smiling face. Fireworks filled the sky above the little house. "You even drew fireworks," Daniel said. It was a New Year's picture. Ruth leaned forward to study the drawing. "You made this last January," she said. Annie nodded. "My teacher said to draw what we hope the year will look like." Daniel noticed something else in the picture. 3 small figures stood beside the house. "Who are they?" he asked. "That's my mom," Annie explained, pointing. "And that's Grandma. And the third one?" Annie hesitated for a moment. "That was supposed to be my dad." Daniel's chest tightened slightly. Ruth placed a gentle hand on Annie's shoulder. "You've always had a good imagination," she said kindly. Annie shrugged. "My teacher says imagination is just practice for real life." Daniel smiled at that. "That's a wonderful way to think about it." Annie suddenly looked up at him. "Now it's your turn." "My turn?" "Yes." "For what?" "To draw a future picture." Daniel laughed softly. "I'm not sure I'm very good at drawing." "That's okay," Annie said. "I wasn't very good the first time either." Ruth stood and reached into a kitchen drawer. "Well," she said calmly, placing a box of crayons on the table. "Every artist deserves proper tools." Daniel looked at the crayons as if they were an unfamiliar piece of technology. "I haven't used these in a very long time." Annie slid a blank sheet of paper toward him. "Just draw what you hope the year will look like." Daniel hesitated. For the past 12 months, he had avoided imagining the future entirely. Every plan he had made before had collapsed. Hope had started to feel like a dangerous investment, but Annie waited patiently. Ruth watched quietly. Daniel picked up a crayon. He stared at the blank page for several seconds. Then he slowly began to draw. His lines were clumsy, but Annie didn't seem to mind. After a minute, she leaned closer. "What's that?" Daniel looked down. "A house." Annie smiled. "That's a good start." Daniel added a few more shapes. A small table, a window, 3 figures standing near the door. Annie studied the drawing carefully. "Is that you?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "And that one?" Daniel paused. "That could be someone important." Annie tilted her head. "Like a daughter?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the drawing again. Then he said quietly, "Maybe." Annie grinned. "See? You're good at future pictures." Ruth leaned back in her chair. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "most people start the year making promises they rarely keep." Daniel glanced at her. "What kind of promises?" "Lose weight, make more money, work harder." Daniel chuckled. "Those sound familiar. But the promises that matter most," Ruth continued, "are usually simpler." Daniel waited. "Stay kind," she said. "Stay honest. And stay when people need you." Daniel absorbed those words slowly. Across the table, Annie had already begun adding more drawings to his paper. She drew a small dog beside the house. "What's that for?" Daniel asked. "Every house needs a dog." Daniel laughed. "That seems reasonable." Annie suddenly froze. Her eyes widened as she stared at something outside the window. "Look." Daniel and Ruth turned toward the glass. 2 children from the neighborhood were running across the snowy sidewalk, pulling a small sled. More families had begun stepping outside now that the morning sun had brightened the sky. New Year's Day had officially begun. Annie pressed her hands against the window. "Can we go outside?" Ruth raised an eyebrow. "You just finished breakfast." "But it's the first snow of the year." Daniel looked at Ruth. Ruth smiled slightly. "I suppose the first day of the year deserves a little fresh air." Annie spun around excitedly. "Come on." Daniel stood slowly. "You're very persuasive," he said. Annie nodded proudly. "My grandma says that's a useful skill." Ruth shook her head with a soft laugh. "Well, Mr. Whitaker," she said, reaching for her coat, "it appears you've been recruited for a snow adventure." Daniel picked up his coat from the chair. For the first time in months, stepping outside into the cold didn't feel like wandering. It felt like joining something. As Annie rushed toward the door, Daniel glanced once more at the drawing still resting on the table. A small house, 3 figures, a dog, and fireworks in the sky. Maybe, he thought quietly, the future wasn't as empty as he once believed. The snow outside felt brighter than it had the night before. New Year's Day sunlight reflected across the fresh white streets, turning the quiet Boston neighborhood into something that looked almost magical. The air was cold but clean, and the sky above the rooftops had cleared into a pale winter blue. Annie burst out of the front door first. "Wait for me," she called back. Already halfway down the small front steps, Daniel stepped carefully onto the porch behind her, adjusting the collar of his coat as the cold air greeted him. Ruth followed more slowly, wrapping a thick scarf around her neck. The snow beneath their boots made soft crunching sounds. Annie spread her arms wide. "Look how much snow we got." Daniel glanced around. The entire street had been transformed overnight. Cars were half covered in white, and the sidewalks held the untouched smoothness of early morning snowfall. "Boston did a good job decorating," he said. Annie laughed. "Snow does that." A group of children further down the street were already building a snowman. Their laughter carried easily through the crisp winter air. Annie pointed. "We should make one too." Daniel looked down at her. "You have a plan for everything today, don't you?" "It's the first day of the year," she replied, as if that explained everything. Ruth chuckled softly from the porch. "She believes the first day sets the tone for the rest of the year." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like a wise tradition." Annie knelt down immediately and began gathering snow with both mittened hands. The snow packed easily, forming a rough ball. Daniel crouched beside her. "Step 1, Annie announced proudly, "is the bottom." Daniel rolled the snowball slowly across the yard, letting it collect more snow as it moved. "It's growing," he said. "That's the idea." Within a few minutes, the base of the snowman stood knee-high. Annie clapped happily. "Now the middle." Daniel rolled a smaller snowball beside the first and lifted it carefully into place. Ruth watched from the porch, smiling as the two of them worked together. For a moment, Daniel forgot entirely about the year behind him. He wasn't thinking about lawsuits, investors, or empty bank accounts. He was simply building a snowman with a 6-year-old girl on a quiet New Year's morning. "Now the head," Annie said. Daniel rolled a third ball and carefully placed it on top. The snowman leaned slightly to one side. Annie tilted her head critically. "He looks like he's thinking." Daniel laughed. "Most snowmen probably are." Annie ran toward the porch. "Grandma! We need buttons." Ruth disappeared briefly inside the house and returned with 3 dark buttons and an old carrot. "Every snowman deserves a proper face," she said. Annie carefully pressed the buttons into the snow for eyes and a smile. Daniel inserted the carrot nose. "There," Annie said proudly, stepping back to admire their work. "He looks friendly." Daniel studied the crooked snowman. "I think he does." The neighborhood had grown livelier while they worked. More families had stepped outside, children pulling sleds and adults carrying mugs of coffee as they greeted neighbors across fences. An older man walking his dog waved from the sidewalk. "Happy New Year," Ruth waved back. "Happy New Year, Mr. Jenkins." The man glanced toward Daniel curiously, but offered a friendly nod. "New neighbor?" Ruth smiled. "Just visiting." Mr. Jenkins tipped his hat politely before continuing down the street. Annie brushed snow from her gloves. "Everyone seems happier today." Daniel followed her gaze. People were smiling more. Children were laughing louder. The first day of the year carried a strange optimism that even adults struggled to resist. "That's because people believe the year is still full of possibilities," Daniel said. Annie nodded thoughtfully. "That's how I feel." She looked up at him. "Do you?" Daniel hesitated. For the past year, he had felt like a man standing in the ruins of something he once built. Possibilities had seemed like a luxury for other people, but standing here now, beside a snowman with a crooked smile and a child who believed every year deserved a fresh beginning, the future didn't feel quite so empty. "I think I'm starting to," he said. Annie grinned. "Good." She suddenly grabbed a handful of snow and gently tossed it at Daniel's coat. The snow burst into powder against his sleeve. Daniel looked down at the white mark. Was that a snowball? Annie tried to hide her smile. "Maybe." Daniel scooped up a small handful of snow and tossed it lightly toward her boots. Annie squealed with laughter. Ruth shook her head from the porch. "You two are going to start a war." "Friendly fire," Daniel said. The snowball exchange lasted only a few minutes, but Annie's laughter filled the yard like music. Eventually, she collapsed into the snow beside the snowman, giggling. Daniel offered her a hand and helped her stand. Her cheeks were red from the cold. "Hot chocolate break?" Ruth called from the porch. Annie immediately nodded. "Yes." They returned inside the house where warmth wrapped around them again. Ruth handed Annie a steaming mug and set another in front of Daniel. The living room windows framed the snow-covered yard where their snowman now stood proudly. Annie climbed onto the couch and sipped her drink. Daniel sat nearby, holding the mug between his hands. After a moment, Annie looked at him. "Daniel?" "Yes. Are you still leaving today?" The question was simple, but it carried more weight than Annie realized. Daniel looked out the window at the snowman they had just built together. A year ago, he had believed his life was finished. Now, sitting in a small house with hot chocolate and laughter still echoing from the yard, he wasn't so sure anymore. He turned back toward Annie. "I'm not in a hurry," he said quietly. Annie smiled, and for the first time since the company collapsed, Daniel Whitaker allowed himself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, the new year had brought him somewhere he was meant to be. The house settled into a calm rhythm that afternoon. Outside, the neighborhood still carried the soft excitement of New Year's Day. Children dragged sleds across snowy sidewalks. Neighbors waved across fences, and the occasional burst of laughter floated through the cold air. Inside the Carter home, warmth filled every room. Annie sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by crayons, paper, and the future drawings she had promised to show Daniel. Several sheets were spread across the coffee table. Daniel sat on the couch nearby, quietly studying them. Each drawing was simple, but they carried the kind of hope only a child could put on paper. One showed a bright yellow school bus. Another had a playground with swings that stretched almost to the sky. One drawing, in particular, caught Daniel's attention. It showed the same little house Annie had drawn earlier, but this time there were 4 figures standing outside instead of 3. Daniel pointed gently. "Who's the new person?" Annie leaned forward. "That one?" "Yes, that's the dad," she said. Daniel glanced up at her. "I thought the dad was already in your first picture." "That one was just a wish," Annie explained. "And this one? This one is the improved version." Daniel couldn't help smiling. "Your planning skills are impressive." Ruth entered from the kitchen carrying a small tray of cookies she had baked earlier in the morning. "Planning is a family habit," she said as she set the tray on the table. Annie grabbed one immediately. Daniel took one more carefully. They were warm and smelled faintly of cinnamon. "These are excellent," he said. Ruth sat down in her usual chair. "Old recipe," she replied. "From my mother." Annie swung her feet happily. "Grandma makes them every New Year's Day." Daniel took another small bite. "Then I arrived on the perfect day." Ruth looked at him thoughtfully. "Perhaps you did." For a few moments they sat quietly. Then Annie suddenly remembered something. "Daniel?" "Dewary." "Yes. You said yesterday you used to run a computer company." "That's right. Does that mean you're very good with computers?" Daniel laughed softly. "I suppose I was." Annie's eyes lit up. "Can you fix mine?" "You have a computer?" "Yes. My mom got me a small one for school." Ruth nodded. "It stopped working last week." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What seems to be the problem?" "It won't turn on," Annie said. Daniel smiled. "That sounds like something we can investigate." Annie jumped up excitedly and ran down the hallway. A few seconds later she returned carrying a small laptop. She placed it on the coffee table with great ceremony. Daniel opened it carefully. "Well," he said, pressing the power button. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The screen flickered. For a moment nothing happened. Then suddenly the computer came to life. Annie gasped. "You fixed it." Daniel chuckled. "All I did was press the power button properly." Annie stared at him in amazement. "You're a genius." Ruth shook her head with a soft laugh. "That's often how technology works." Daniel closed the laptop gently. "It's a good machine," he said. Annie hugged the computer to her chest. "Thank you." Daniel shrugged lightly. "I'm glad I could help." Ruth studied him quietly. "You still have useful skills, Mr. Whitaker." Daniel looked at his hands. "I suppose I do." Ruth leaned back in her chair. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "our community center runs computer classes for older residents." Daniel looked up. "Really?" "They struggle with things like email and online forms." Annie nodded eagerly. "Grandma says the internet confuses them." Ruth smiled. "It does." Daniel considered the idea. For months he had felt as if the world no longer had a place for him. The business world had moved on quickly after his company collapsed. But teaching, helping people understand technology, that felt different. "I might be able to help with something like that," he said slowly. Ruth nodded. "I thought you might." Annie clapped happily. "See? I told you the new year would bring a plan. Daniel looked at her. You're very confident about that. Because it's already happening. Daniel glanced out the living room window again. The snowman they had built earlier still stood proudly in the yard, leaning slightly but smiling toward the street. A neighbor's dog had walked past earlier and sniffed it with great curiosity. The scene felt simple, peaceful, real. Ruth stood slowly. Well, she said, I believe the afternoon calls for another pot of tea. Annie returned to her drawings. Daniel leaned back on the couch. For the first time in over a year, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something to collapse. Instead, he felt like something new had quietly begun. And sometimes, he realized, the beginning of a new life didn't arrive with grand announcements. Sometimes it arrived in small ways. A warm house, a curious child, and a second chance on the first day of the year. The afternoon slowly turned into evening. Winter sunlight faded early behind the rooftops of Boston, and the quiet neighborhood outside the Carter house began to glow under the soft yellow lights of porch lamps and street lights. The snow that had fallen the night before still covered the ground, untouched in some places, packed into sled tracks in others. Inside the house, the warmth had deepened. The small living room now smelled faintly of tea and cinnamon cookies. Annie had spread even more papers across the coffee table, drawing what she proudly called version 3 of her future picture. Daniel watched her from the couch. He had spent most of the afternoon helping her figure out simple computer games and showing her how to type her name properly on the keyboard. Annie had decided this made him the official technology helper of the house. Ruth sat in her usual chair near the window, knitting quietly. The rhythm of the room felt peaceful. Daniel realized something strange. He had not checked his phone all day. In his previous life, that would have been impossible. Messages, emails, conference calls, investors, all of it, had once demanded his attention every minute. Now the phone rested quietly on the table beside him, and for the first time in years, silence felt comfortable. Annie suddenly held up another drawing. Daniel, he looked over. Yes? Look at this one. He leaned forward. The picture showed the small house again. The snowman from the yard now appeared beside it, smiling proudly with his carrot nose. Fireworks still filled the sky above the roof. But this time the figures in the drawing looked different. There were still 4, but one of them looked taller. Daniel pointed gently. That one looks suspiciously like me. Annie grinned. It is you. Ruth chuckled softly without looking up from her knitting. You've been promoted, Mr. Whitaker. Daniel leaned back with a small laugh. I didn't even apply for the position. Annie shrugged. Some jobs find you. Daniel shook his head. You might be the youngest philosopher I've ever met. Annie looked pleased with that title. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Outside the window, the sky had turned deep blue. Then Daniel's phone buzzed suddenly. The sound surprised him. He picked it up and glanced at the screen. An unfamiliar number. He hesitated, then answered. Hello? The voice on the other end was professional and slightly cautious. Mr. Whitaker? Daniel straightened slightly. Yes. This is Martin Hayes from Whitaker Dynamics Legal Department. Daniel's expression changed. Annie noticed immediately. Ruth looked up from her knitting. Daniel stood slowly and walked toward the hallway. I'll take this in the other room, he said quietly. Annie nodded but watched him carefully as he stepped away. Daniel moved into the kitchen. What can I do for you, Martin? He asked. The lawyer hesitated. Well, the bankruptcy review finished this morning. Daniel leaned against the counter. And there were some irregularities in the reports filed by the investment board. Daniel frowned. Irregularities? Yes. Martin's voice lowered. It appears several of the losses blamed on your management were actually caused by unauthorized trading decisions made by the board after you stepped down for your wife's medical leave. Daniel's heart beat slightly faster. That's not what the report said. We know, Martin replied. The evidence was hidden in secondary filings. Daniel stayed silent. Zir, Martin continued. To put it simply, the investigation clears you of responsibility for the collapse. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. For months he had carried the weight of that failure. The public had blamed him. The media had blamed him. He had blamed himself. You're saying the company didn't fall because of me? That's correct. Daniel exhaled slowly. There's more, Martin added. Daniel waited. The investors who pushed for bankruptcy are now facing legal consequences. And what does that mean for me? It means your professional reputation is likely to recover. Daniel looked toward the living room where Annie's voice could be heard softly. And the company? Whitaker Dynamics is gone, Martin said honestly. But your name is no longer the reason why. Daniel stood very still. For the first time in a year, the shadow that had followed him everywhere felt lighter. Thank you for telling me, he said quietly. Of course, Martin replied. And Mr. Whitaker? Yes, you might want to check the financial settlement filed this afternoon. What settlement? You'll see. The call ended. Daniel remained in the kitchen for several seconds. He looked down at his phone. Then he slowly returned to the living room. Annie immediately looked up. Was that important? Daniel sat down on the couch. It might have been. Ruth watched him carefully. Good news or bad? Daniel thought for a moment. Unexpected news. Annie tilted her head. Does that mean the year is getting better? Daniel looked at the drawing on the table again. The little house, the snowman, the 4 figures standing together. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It might, he said softly, and Annie smiled like she had known that all along. Daniel Whitaker sat quietly on the couch for several minutes after the call ended. Annie had returned to her drawings, humming softly to herself while adding bright blue fireworks above the little house in her picture. Ruth's knitting needles clicked gently in the corner of the room, their steady rhythm filling the peaceful silence of the evening. Outside the window, night had fully settled across the neighborhood. Streetlights reflected across the snow-covered sidewalks, and the houses along the block glowed warmly as families finished their New Year's Day dinners. Daniel leaned back and exhaled slowly. For months, he had carried a quiet burden he rarely spoke about. When Whitaker Dynamics collapsed, the headlines had been merciless. Investors lost money, employees lost jobs. Commentators on television called it a cautionary tale about ambition and poor leadership. Daniel had believed those stories. He had believed that he had destroyed the company. But now, hearing the truth from the lawyer, something inside him had shifted. Not everything that happened had been his fault. He glanced across the room at Annie. She had finished another drawing and was now coloring the roof of the little house bright orange. What color is that supposed to be? Daniel asked. Annie looked up proudly. Sunset orange. Daniel smiled. That sounds very specific. My teacher says sunsets mean the day is ending, but the sky is still beautiful. Ruth chuckled softly. That teacher deserves a raise. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Annie, can I ask you something? She nodded. Of course. Why did you sit down beside me at the bus stop last night? Annie seemed surprised by the question. Because you were alone. That's true. And because, she continued, you looked like someone who needed company. Daniel nodded slowly. But there were probably lots of people alone in the city last night. Yes, Annie said. Why me? She thought about it carefully. Then she said something very simple. You looked kind. Daniel felt a quiet warmth spread through his chest. Ruth spoke gently from her chair. Children notice things adults miss. Daniel believed that. He had spent most of the past year surrounded by people who judged success by numbers, profits, and headlines. But Annie had looked at him and seen something else, something human. He glanced again at the drawing on the coffee table. The house, the snowman, the 4 figures. Annie, he said softly. Yes, if your future picture came true, what would that feel like? She didn't hesitate. Warm. Warm. Warm? Yes, she said. Like sitting at the table together every night. Daniel looked toward the kitchen where they had eaten soup only a day earlier. That sounds nice. It is, Annie said confidently. We do it every day. Daniel smiled. He turned toward Ruth. Your granddaughter has a remarkable sense of what matters. Ruth nodded quietly. She learned it the hard way. Daniel didn't ask for details. He understood enough. For a moment, the 3 of them simply sat together while the quiet house wrapped around them. Then Annie yawned. A long, unmistakable yawn. Ruth laughed softly. I believe someone's New Year's excitement is finally catching up with her. Annie rubbed her eyes. I'm not sleepy. Daniel chuckled. That's exactly what you said last night. Ruth stood and gently gathered the drawings from the table. Bedtime. Annie stood reluctantly but didn't argue. Before heading down the hallway, she paused beside Daniel. Daniel, yes? Are you still here tomorrow? The question lingered in the air. Daniel looked toward Ruth. Ruth didn't say anything. She simply watched him calmly. Daniel looked back at Annie. I think so, he said. Annie smiled. Good. She disappeared down the hallway toward her bedroom. Ruth followed a few minutes later to tuck her in. Daniel remained on the couch. The house grew quiet again. Outside, the snow reflected the soft glow of the streetlights. He thought about the phone call, the investigation clearing his name, the possibility that his reputation could recover. A year ago, he would have immediately started planning his return to the business world. But tonight, the idea didn't feel urgent. For the first time in years, success felt less important than something else: belonging. A few minutes later, Ruth returned from the hallway. "She's asleep already," she said. Daniel nodded. She had a big day. Ruth sat down in her chair again. "Mr. Whitaker," she said gently, "life sometimes gives us unexpected crossroads." Daniel looked at her. "I think I just reached one." Ruth smiled. "Most people do at the beginning of a new year." Daniel leaned back and looked toward the window. Outside, the snowman still stood in the yard, slightly crooked but smiling proudly beneath the streetlight. "I came to that bus stop last night thinking I had nowhere left to go," Daniel said quietly. Ruth folded her hands in her lap. "And now?" Daniel considered the question. He thought about the small house, the pancakes that morning, the drawings on the table, the child who believed the future could still be bright. He smiled softly. "Now," he said, "I think I might have found a place to begin again." Ruth nodded as if she had expected that answer all along. And outside, under the quiet winter sky, the first peaceful night of the new year continued. This story reminds us that sometimes the most important changes in life begin with a small act of kindness. Daniel believed he had lost everything: his career, his home, and his purpose. But Annie, a little girl with a hopeful heart, saw something different. She saw a lonely man who simply needed a place to belong. Through her innocence and courage, Daniel discovered that a family is not always defined by blood or wealth, but by compassion, trust, and the willingness to stay when someone needs you. The message of this story is simple, but powerful. When people choose kindness instead of indifference, they can transform not only another person's life, but their own as well. Sometimes the home we are searching for is found in the hearts of those who refuse to let us face the world alone. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.